20 watts in the brain.
That's right.
And about 10,000 watts for ChatGPT.
It's crazy.
Yes. Tell me what you think about all this.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly as a computer scientist and someone who likes to write efficient stuff, the amount of waste that's there in today's AI is crazy. Right? And in the brain, though, it's very different.
Yeah.
If you look at the brain, most of the brain is actually silent at any point in time.
That's
and
right.
what the brain does really well is very intelligently figure out what aspect you actually have to compute. And because metabolic energy is expensive for us.
Why do you think all these smart people in AI are not looking at this problem? They're just throwing more CPUs at it, more power at it.
Because that's the way to optimize for the next 6 to 12 months to 24 months. Short term. And you can throw more money at it, you can make it larger, throw more data at it, and things get better.
And they're still more cost effective than maybe humans that they're replacing.
Exactly, for now.
So for now.
That's right, It's and it's economically become so valuable that it's worth just throwing money at it.
Subutai, thank you for taking the time to speak with me about energy efficiency and AI. We've known each other a long time. I know you quite well, but the audience doesn't, so would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Subutai Ahmad, founder and CTO of Numenta currently. I guess I grew up in India as a kid in Calcutta, moved to Hong Kong when I was in middle school, and then came to New York for high school, and then continued on west out here to California. So probably not a surprise to anyone that my intellectual curiosity also spans a lot of borders, and I'm a very interdisciplinary person as a result.
What prompted you to go into AI all those years ago in Illinois and spend such a big chunk of your career just pursuing this idea?
Yeah, so my original interest actually started as an undergrad when I took a class in cognitive psychology. So I was a computer scientist, but as I started to look at psychology, I realized that sort of understanding the brain and sort of replicating the brain from a computer scientist position is probably the hardest problem you could solve as a computer scientist. So I decided that's what I wanted to focus on.
Good.
So then,
so you went to grad school and you pursued that.
Yeah. So in Illinois, I got exposed to neuroscience, and that's where I realized, there's actually potentially an algorithmic underpinning that psychology was too high level for me. But with neuroscience, there's mechanisms. You can see the mechanisms. You can imagine actually implementing that stuff.
So you spent the last chunk of time at Numenta.
That's right,
Big chunk of time. Why?
Yeah, so even though I was really interested in neuroscience for my PhD, commercially, I couldn't really follow that passion. I did startups and did computer vision and AI stuff, but I couldn't really follow the passion of understanding the brain. Then in 2005, I met up with Jeff Hawkins just after he had founded Numenta. And the mission of Numenta was to really deeply understand the brain and apply it to AI. So I was, that's the perfect company for me. And so I joined
20 years later.
20 years later. None of us thought it would take this long, by the way.
The brain? Well, it's not an easy problem to crack.
That's true. Yeah.
So now we have this interesting problem. The neural network architecture that was sort of invented in the 50s is still being used today, right?
That's right.
And so it results in one of the most inefficient software that you can imagine building. 20 watts in the brain.
That's right.
And about 10,000 watts for ChatGPT.
It's crazy.
Yes. Tell me what you think about all this.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly as a computer scientist and someone who likes to write efficient stuff, the amount of waste that's there in today's AI is crazy.
Right? Tell me about vanilla ice cream, and you're computing everything in the universe, and then you throw everything away and tell you about vanilla ice cream.
That's right. And in the brain, though, it's very different.
Yeah.
If you look at the brain, most of the brain is actually silent at any point in time. What the brain does really well is very intelligently figure out what aspect you actually have to compute. Because metabolic energy is expensive for us. So.
Yeah, and you can see it, right, in videos of the brain working when you talk to people. You can see different parts lighting up when they're active.
Exactly. You can see that. And so there's been a lot of evolutionary pressure to come up with very, very efficient algorithms.
Yes.
So we know it's possible.
Yeah.
Right?
So how do you think about fixing this problem? I mean, it's a huge problem, right? The U.S. is thinking about creating tons more extra energy supply in order to run AI. And I'm thinking, well, if we just made the software a bit more efficient, we wouldn't have to do that, right? Well, how do you think the approaches should be like? Should it be, okay, let's rethink this architecture thing? Or should we think about, well, we've got this transformer model on LLMs with reinforcement learning. Should we just try to optimize that? So how do you think?
So I think it has to be a combination of algorithms and hardware. The two need to be working together.
Hardware too, okay.
Yeah, hardware as well. And hardware is actually a pretty big issue. So there's this notion called the hardware lottery. And this is a very fundamental trap that the AI world has fallen into for about 2 decades.
Explain that.
Yeah, so the hardware lottery is the following concept. It comes from a paper by Sarah Hooker. And what she pointed out is that when we think of new algorithms and new innovations, if it doesn't work efficiently on today's hardware, we discard that path. And we are bound to only write algorithms that run well on
GPU model.
The GPU model.
A CPU model first, and then now the GPU model.
Exactly. And the GPU model has, as everyone knows, huge momentum.
Floating point.
And it's incredibly brute force.
Yes.
And the way these things work, it's sort of like, imagine as a computer scientist, you're trying to sort a lot of numbers. You can come up with a naive algorithm that's n squared. And so you write hardware that makes n squared algorithms faster. And so instead of n squared, it's now n squared divided by 10. But it's still n squared. And that's what the transformer architecture is. It's fundamentally an n squared algorithm, but you know what? There's something like quicksort, which you could go way faster, but you can't do that.
I think half our audience will understand what an n squared algorithm is. The other half, could you explain that?
Yeah. Basically, what
n versus n squared versus.
Yeah. So basically, if it's n squared, the amount of time and energy and cost you'll need grows as quadratically as the square of the length of the problem, the size of the problem, which is really unsustainable. Order n only grows with the problem, and that you can, as the problem goes bigger, your compute costs grow in proportion, but not as a square of the problem. Right.
Yeah. And some of them are worse, right? Exponential.
Exponential, which actually is where we are today with AI. If you look at kind of the pace of hardware innovation, it grows approximately like Moore's law. So it's growing exponentially.
Oh, it's great. Okay.
So that's let's say doubling every 18. Yeah, let's say doubling every 18 months, right? So it's still growing, but if you look at the compute cost required by AI, it's exponentially more than that exponential. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. So why do you think all these smart people in AI are not looking at this problem? They're just throwing more CPUs at it, more power at it.
Yeah. Because that's the way to optimize for the next 6 to 12 months to 24 months. Short term. And you can throw more money at it. You can make it larger. Throw more data at it, and things get better.
And they're still more cost effective than maybe humans that they're replacing.
Some of these for now.
So for now,
that's right. It's and it's economically become so valuable that it's worth just throwing money at it.
Where do you think that stops? Because you don't have enough power. You can't turn off a city to power an AI, right?
That's a really interesting question. There's so much momentum. Companies are spending hundreds of billions in CapEx now in building data centers, and the power usage is growing very, very fast, exponentially, and they're building nuclear power plants next to data centers.
To supply, 3 Mile Island was rebooted, I heard.
Exactly. Oh, really? It doesn't surprise me.
Maybe that's fake news.
But it doesn't surprise me. And the amount of cooling you need, water is a huge issue. These data centers take up more water than entire towns take up as well. So that's a big. I did not realize that's a big issue as well.
And they're putting I think Microsoft is putting some of these data centers underwater, and they'll heat up the ocean, I guess.
Just what we need, right?
Okay, so what do you think we should do with all this? What if you had a way to tell the leaders in the AI industry, this is what you should be doing? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think we need to break away from the hardware lottery. And so we need to give ourselves the intellectual freedom and the discipline to not just be brute force, but to look and be computer scientists, come up with algorithms that are fundamentally more efficient. And in our case, we draw inspiration from the brain, but we should allow ourselves that ability to do it. And it might not pay benefits in 6 months or 12 months, but over time, it's going to be huge.
Yeah. Just to give the audience a sense, right? In the 50s, they came up with this perceptron model, which is a bunch of inputs, summation, and if it's above a certain threshold, the neuron fires. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
And this is the fundamental component of all the LLMs, all the AIs we've built just
Exactly.
about, right? Tell me about what we've learned since the 50s about how neurons work and why the brain is so much more efficient, at least from your purchase at Numenta.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So that what's called the point neuron model was developed in the 40s and 50s. So Rosenblatt and others came up with sort of algorithms that mimic that. And so that model has still persisted today. 70 years.
No one bothered to update that model.
Exactly, and in the 80s they came up with backpropagation, which allows you to build bigger networks or deeper networks
of the same
type.
Point
models, and if you look at that point neuron, if you have a layer of these neurons and you have an input coming in, mathematically what you have to do is a matrix multiplication, right, to do that, and that's why these GPUs are just focused on large-scale matrix multiplication. These networks are getting bigger and bigger, but in neuroscience didn't stop in the 1950s. It's not like there's nothing been discovered. So that neuroscience has come up with amazing discoveries over the last 60, 70 years. None of that's in today's AI. It's kind of incredible. So if you look at the neuron model, that point neuron model that you described, linear weighted sum and nonlinearity, that only accounts for about 4 to 5% of a neuron's synapses.
And they're mostly in the lower brain, right?
Mostly in the lower, even in the neocortex, actually. That piece is there. But the neuron is way more complicated than that. So it might have, let's say, 2 to 10,000 connections. Only about 100 or 200 actually follow that law. The rest are completely nonlinear and have complicated dynamics. And what we've learned is a lot of that is about making neurons a lot more power efficient.
And just the idea of having a suppressor input, right? Just turns off entire chunks of the brain.
That's right.
That itself is an idea that we could make use of.
Exactly. And so, exactly. So neuron, in the neuroscience, they've learned a lot about those circuit motifs, and these things encourage incredibly sparse representations. So very few of the neurons are actually active because of this sort of winner-take-all kind of circuit thing. So there's inhibitory mechanisms that are there. And all of these other connections in the neuron, turns out what they're doing is trying to figure out which neuron should be active for this particular input. So it's a lot of logic to actually suppress things that only promote the neurons that are actually relevant to this context.
Yes.
And there's nothing like that in today's AI systems. It's just one example of what people have figured out.
Can you get there using the standard models? No, you need to change the neuron itself, right?
We think you need to change the neurons. You have to, and unfortunately, that kind of circuit does not work well on a GPU.
Yes.
You have to be very selective in how you do it, not a brute force mechanism. And so you need to break away from a GPU mentality.
Frankly, I suspect if you can serialize the consumption, you could end up being okay on a CPU, right? Without being on a GPU.
Yeah, the problem is, GPUs have huge compute power. So your algorithmic innovation on the CPU has to be sufficiently powerful to overcome the great increase in GPU capacity over the years. So you need orders of magnitude kind of effects.
But there are, 10,000, 20 watts. There's several orders of magnitude there to be had.
Exactly.
So I one of the two books from your colleague Jeff Hawkins, really set my brain thinking differently about AI, right? First was on artificial intelligence, right?
Yeah.
This was from 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah. So on intelligence, around 2002, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I refer to that as sort of an Einsteinian moment in AI because the realization is that there's proof by existence that there is an intelligence architecture,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Our brain, right? So therefore it's doable, right?
Right.
Before that, I haven't heard that articulation, right? All this time in AI. But his most recent book was actually very, very interesting for many reasons. Would you like to, comment?
Sure.
On
I can
stuff?
talk about that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting what you mentioned about the intelligence architecture.
Yeah.
So this is another discovery in neuroscience by someone called Vernon Mountcastle in the 70s. And what he discovered is that there's a canonical microcircuit in the neocortex, which is the largest part of your brain. That's the part that's responsible for intelligent functioning. And this is maybe 50 to 100,000 neurons that are connected up in this particular pattern of connections. And then it's called a cortical column, and it repeats. And so we have hundreds of thousands of these in our brain. But each of them are almost identical in structure. So if you look at the visual parts of your brain or the language parts or the auditory part, they all have basically the same structure. There are differences, but they're basically exactly. But that's a great finding because as a computer scientist, it means there is a pattern.
Yeah.
You don't have to understand the entire brain. You have to understand one cortical column and how they connect up. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So his latest, Jeff's latest book, The Thousand Brains Theory of Intelligence, takes that, explains what a cortical column does. And so what we found out is the cortical column does everything that the full brain does because it's just a replicated version. Wow. And so what we have is not one brain, but hundreds of thousands of brains.
Millions.
Hence the name of the theory.
That's very interesting. And they vote to decide who wins. Right?
Exactly. So each one is it's a very distributed system. Each one is trying to figure out its little input, what's going on in its input, and then you come to a consensus across the cortical column.
So all of us suffer from multiple personality disorder.
Exactly. Yeah.
By definition.
Yeah. What we think is when the system votes and comes to a conclusion on things, and that's sort of what the level of our consciousness is about. And
before that,
it's sort of subconscious.
It's just a lot of people yelling at us that we don't know about.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting approach to optimizing AI.
Yeah.
Which will require some really fundamental changes in how we look at hardware, how we look at all the stuff we've done the last 10, 20 years on LLMs, etc. There is another group that's working, or another set of people that are thinking about this problem that look at it very differently, right? And maybe the people at DeepSeek do this, maybe they don't, but they've managed to create this architecture that's very significantly more efficient than today's stuff. Can you tell me what you understand about that?
Yeah, I think that the DeepSeek moment in AI has been very refreshing in many ways because, in my conversations with investors and partners, everyone now has this idea or a thought that, maybe there is another way. Maybe there is a way to become more efficient. That was not in our consciousness before. What DeepSeek did is they took a lot of techniques that had already been developed. They put it together in a really intelligent way. Plus, they came up with a couple of techniques on their own to make training and inference a lot more efficient. Yeah. But it's still fundamentally GPU based. Yes. So they were able to maybe divide by 10 or something, make things 10 times cheaper or faster, but it's still very brute force.
Yes.
But at least people now realizing that, okay, if you do really good engineering, really good computer science, maybe there's ways to really think about things differently.
Yeah. Well, from your point of view, what are the few things they did that you were impressed about? The mixture of experts, using less precision.
Yeah. So mixture of experts has been around for a while.
Yeah.
So.
But to cost the
so they did a really good job in training with mixture of experts to and basically briefly, a mixture of experts is when you have a large-scale transformer model.
Mm-hmm.
It has dozens to hundreds of layers, and what mixture of experts is they carve up each layer into smaller experts and only invoke a subset of them.
Yeah.
And they figured out how to train those even more efficiently on GPUs. They didn't invent the mixture of experts architecture, but they figured out how to make it do well. Also, you mentioned precision, so they figured out techniques for going. Normally, what people do is they train with 16 bits of precision. Yeah. And 8-bit has been supported in the hardware, but it's been hard to train that in a stable manner. And so they figured out really good ways to train with FP8. Yeah. We also did really clever engineering.
Just that alone, I'm assuming, doubles the efficiency.
Yeah, right? Exactly. So that doubles the efficiency. Yeah. The mixture of experts, maybe another doubling or quadrupling. And then they did some really smart engineering and how to distribute stuff across a GPU cluster.
And how does reinforcement learning play a part in that? I know that's one of the big things they did.
Yeah, they did some stuff on training things really efficiently. So with reinforcement learning, you have to give feedback to the network as to correct the correct way to
drift.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what they did is some clever ways to engineer that problem. So by making the system actually think a little bit more, they created more kind of learning data to train the network.
So you don't have to brute force your way through lots and lots of data.
It's still pretty brute force. It's still pretty brute force, but it's a way to improve accuracy.
By an order of magnitude less brute force. Is that right?
Yeah, so basically the problem is I think when you have a given training data set, you need to be able to, it gives you a certain level of accuracy and you need to be able to create new data to train on. And so they did a smart version of that.
Okay.
And others are doing that as well.
Okay. Right? How much... So I'm stating something which I think is correct, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. I think the bulk of compute usage in the world is on inference, right? Mm-hmm. Not on training.
That's right. Yeah.
So how does the split up of results occur in DeepSeek? Is it much more efficient on training, or is it much more efficient on inference? How does it?
Yeah, so they do a bit of both, but primarily their innovations were in training. So they figured out ways to really reduce the cost of the training itself. But at inference time, because they're using mixture of experts and they managed to make it a larger mixture of experts, it does reduce the inference time. However, newer models, including DeepSeek, do this thing called chain of thought reasoning. Yes. And so that actually increases the inference time at a factor of 10 or 100.
Yeah. So you get some, you win some, you lose some.
Yeah. So you win some, you lose a lot because
you lose a lot. Okay.
Because now, so maybe you made things a factor of 3 or 4 more efficient at inference time, but now it's a factor of 100 more on top of the so maybe it's a 20x increase. Maybe it's not a 100x increase, but it's still a 20x increase.
That's like the think deeply or explain your thinking.
Yeah. Right? And the way that works is the model there's a way to make it kind of continue down a path of reasoning, if you will, and it keep feeding the input back to itself. Yeah. And it spends more time coming up with the correct answer. Yeah. So the results are really impressive, but it needs a lot more inference time compute. Yeah.
But maybe measured against results is okay.
Yes, that's right. Cool. And you mentioned the ratio of inference time cost versus training time cost. Yes. So this chain of thought reasoning really exacerbates it. Now the inference time cost is that much higher. Right? Yeah.
Wonder if you can No, I guess it's hard. I was going to say, so I shouldn't be thinking by myself. I should not articulate this.
Well, that's like chain of thought.
Yes. I'm assuming that you cannot do this chain of thought stuff at the learning at time of learning, because the combinatorial requirements is just too high, right? So you create.
So they are actually doing that. They're starting to do more and more of that because transformer architectures and like ChatGPT, the more data you throw at it, the better it gets.
Yeah.
However, they're running out of data
Yeah.
to train on. So they have to create data somehow. And so they're actually doing much more kind of training time inference and compute to actually really increase the amount of training time, training data that's available.
So that's another optimization.
Potentially, yeah.
So what do you think? do we have to go back to basics and re-engineer AI from the neuron on up, or can we get to some level of efficiency just hacking the system?
Yeah, so yes and no.
Yes, okay.
So I'll give you Numenta's point of view. What we've done is if you think about what cortical columns do, going back to Mountcastle's idea, they learn, what we do is fundamentally we and cortical columns learn by moving around in the world.
Yeah.
So we learn about the structure of the world, which allows us to learn new things very, very quickly. That will require a radical new architecture. And we have actually taken that and spun that out into a separate nonprofit called the Thousand Brains Project to look at how can we leapfrog today's AI, looking at 5-10 years into the future. What we're doing at Numenta is taking the other bet, which is that we can incrementally take our way there. So we've been actually able to take transformer architectures, include some of the efficiencies of the way the brain works, such as the neuron model itself, and improve the efficiencies by a factor of 100 or more. Wow. And so, we're taking the bet that you can start there and incrementally move forward. Okay. So I think we don't know yet which approach will win out. I'm putting my bet in the incremental side that we can actually grow our way there bit by bit.
And because then if the big idea succeeds, you can
we can incorporate that, exactly. Yeah. There's no company better positioned to take those ideas and run with it than Numenta.
Yes.
Since those are also our ideas.
Very cool. Yeah. When it comes to, I'm going to shift the topic a little bit, because of how the world looks at AI right now and the amount of energy that's needed to run AI. From a public policy perspective, how do you think about setting incentives so that we think in the right direction, we as an industry think in the right direction, instead of brute force causing us to be able to deliver something incrementally better 6 months from now? How do we incent the industry to solve the problem fundamentally, right? Or does governments need to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. I go back to fundamentally breaking the hardware lottery. We have to allow ourselves room to innovate. So I think it goes to hardware architectures. We need to incentivize completely new hardware architectures.
Don't get locked into the GPU
Don't get locked into the GPU model. And the second part is innovate on software algorithms. Yeah. And I actually think the two have to go together. Yeah. You can't just develop hardware in a vacuum. If there's no algorithm to run on your hardware, it's not going to be worth it.
So maybe we should tell Jensen at NVIDIA that he should take all the money he has now and implement, try new architectures, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if they are.
They are.
Right? Yeah. They realize these issues as well.
Yeah.
And so, so we need, going back to your question on policy and stuff, is there a way to craft public policy? And I'm not an expert in that area at all, but is there a way to craft public policy to really encourage this and create an innovator's dilemma? We want a disruptive new technology, not one that just keeps going.
My worry is just the amount of sheer energy we require, right?
Yes.
I mean, I always joke about which city do you want to turn off to run the AIs, right?
Exactly.
It's as a software engineer also, I philosophically think it's lazy on our part, right? Not to optimize the stuff we build.
That's right.
Yeah. So let's get to
I mean, have you seen policy initiatives that could go
Not
this way?
No. All I see around the world are people building data centers and
Right.
power generation capabilities to try and keep up.
Yeah.
Right? It's a brute force approach, and no one's asking. I'm sure some people within administrations are asking, okay, this is a really brute force way. Is there a more, fine-grained way to do it?
I can point out the CHIPS Act in the U.S. It had a component that was focused on innovative architectures.
Yeah.
However, I don't think you can do that in isolation. Again, you need the algorithmic side too.
And it wasn't about, the CHIPS Act wasn't about incentives. It's more about here's a lot of money.
Here's a chunk of money. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I don't know how that will drive innovation. Right? Oh, good. I'll take the money. So you and I have had conversations about how as intelligence commoditizes, we start to have to converge on things that we value as humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trust, for example, getting AI to do trust. And so I tend to be a techno-optimist, not just because I want the world to be that way. I think the thing about technology is in a free market, it'll be optimized to what we want. And we want to live in a world where there's more trust, there's more goodness, etc., etc. Tell me how you think about this. And then what do you hope actually will happen? What keeps you hopeful about where the world is going?
Yeah, let me first start with the efficiency issues again, since that's the topic. So with the incredible cost of AI today, only a few companies can really train large AI models today. Right? And so, you're beholden to these kind of silos that are out there. If we can make AI so efficient such that everyone could have their own AI, in the limit. Imagine that it's trivial to train the cost of training an AI model is proportional to the cost of a human.
Yes.
In that case, everyone could have their own AI, right? In that case, going back to trust, now you can have AI agents or AI systems that are yours, not someone else's that you're using, but fundamentally yours.
Yeah.
So I do think if we can make things as efficient as the biological system, we should be able to get, and I think that seems like a precursor to this. You can't, you can't be beholden to someone else's business model.
Yeah.
You really need someone that's looking out, or an agent that's looking out for you yourself.
Yeah.
So I think that's a necessary, something like that is a necessary piece,
at least
right?
You have the option. Like today, you have the option of running your own mail server at home.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Most people don't, but
Right.
you still have the option.
Yeah.
So if the companies piss you off, you go, okay, I'm going to run my own server, my own AI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, companies that are, startup where the cost of AI is small enough that they don't have to look at a business model that's focused on selling your data or exploiting you.
Yes.
Right?
Good thing.
Yeah.
Good thing. How about personally and for your family? How do you think about this? It's what we thought about in grad school about what we could build with these machines is starting to come true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so how do you think about all that with respect to how it could affect your family, yourself, the quality of life, and people in general?
Yeah, I think there's tremendous potential there. It's hard to imagine all the different things that could happen, but there's so many different opportunities for really personalized AI systems to really improve the quality of your life.
Yeah.
Imagine if you had a doctor that was your doctor that's constantly measuring, different attributes and measurements from your body constantly, right? And being able to tell you and warn you of different things, give you feedback constantly. your health would be a lot better.
Much better.
A lot better.
I have a friend building one.
Okay. Great. I'd probably be one of the first customers.
Yeah, he'll open up here soon.
So that's just an example of what could be done. Now, I wouldn't want a large company like Google or someone else running that for me.
Yeah.
Right. I want to have real trust that data stays locked within our family.
So what do you think? Will it be you learn to trust these companies even if they're big because there's very little difference between the founder and the technology, right? All the policies around the AI is defined by the founder. So effectively, you're just trusting that one person or the CEO. Is that okay? Is that good enough? It's like they run your mail server, right? Or they run your AI and you just work with them. Or do you really need to run your own AI from your
I don't think we need to run our own AI, but we need to have trust in that company and transparency of their business model. You want to make sure their business model is not around exploiting personal data. And there may be a few other attributes like that. It's a good question. I mean, figuring out exactly when you can trust. These systems.
I mean, it's also a question of business models, right? If you think the world is going to a place where everyone has their own AI at home, then you're buying, you're selling these boxes that for people to run at home, right? As opposed to a company that runs it for 1 million people.
Exactly. There's also this notion of a transparent society. If you're familiar with Brin, who wrote this book, the science fiction author.
David Brin?
David Brin, so his thought process was, what if we go the opposite extreme? Every bit of data is completely public and open to everyone, completely transparent society. So it's a very interesting thesis. Under that scenario, no one would be able to exploit data any more than others. There would be no crime because everything is recorded, and you know right away when someone does something.
And there's no privacy.
There's no privacy. But privacy, I think, is a pretty new phenomenon. When humans were evolving, we were living in tribes and villages and stuff. There was no privacy. There was no soundproofing. There was no,
I don't know.
If you wanted privacy, you had to go somewhere.
I think they do.
But relatively speaking, I think there's a lot more concern
the village gossips
privacy.
And everyone knows everything in the end. Maybe maybe privacy is necessary. I don't know. I think it's difficult given human nature. There's some part of us that want privacy.
Yes, but is it a good thing?
It almost doesn't matter, right? We want it.
We want it.
We want sugar. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share about this world we're moving into?
I think it's uncharted waters. There's things are moving incredibly fast. Sometimes I wonder if we are in the singularity right now because it's really hard to predict what's going to happen a few months from now. But I think as long as we stay focused on some of these fundamental things around trust and
building for human values.
Building for human values is a great way to put it, and creating incentives to enable that to happen. I'm very, very optimistic about the future.
Great. Okay. Let's see if there's any. I think we're good for now. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I might tap you later on to get your thoughts on other things.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you for having me.
This is fun. We should do it again.
We should do it exactly.
Ring around the Milky Way, what will happen, who can say? Robots helping day by day, making life a cheerful play. Twinkle, twinkle, robot friend, what new things are around the bend? Questions, answers, big and small, AI helping through it all. Clap your hands and spin around, see what wonders can be found. In the future we will see all the things that AI can be.